but we are really very happy to get you at the SMO Center online in virtual platform. And your host was Shadar Gupta will definitely introduce you to the audience.
Yeah. So a very warm welcome from SMO Center. So today's speaker is Professor Pratap Raichaudhuri. Many of you know him. I mean, those particularly who are in the condensed matter physics research area. Pratap is a well-known experimentalist who works at PIFR, and his specialization is superconductivity mostly, which he is going to talk about today, and also magnetism. And he specializes on transport-based spectroscopic study and thin films. And well, his career profile, I was looking into it. It's very interesting because he was integrated master student in IIT Kharagpur, and he won the Professor K.L. Chopra Endowment Prize for the best experimental project. And also his thesis got a best thesis award, which was from PIFR. And after that, he was a postdoc in University of Birmingham before coming back to the country and joining PIFR as a faculty. He got Shanti Karu Bhatnagar Prize in 2014. So, Pratap, now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for this. I hope
I
that.
can continue this way, no problem. Yeah, you can continue.
All right. Okay, so thank you, Tanushree, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting to give this talk. So, what I'll be talking about today is a rather recent observation that we had of a hexatic vortex fluid. Now, what I mean by hexatic vortex fluid will get clearer as I get along. So, before I start, let me mention my collaborators in this work. So, this work was done, the experimental work was entirely done in our group by the students and postdocs and the scientific staff who are listed here. For material growth, the man we always go to is our colleague Orugan Thamijabel, and here also he has a very strong contribution for growing very high quality targets, which we use later on to make thin films. And in theory, we have a standing collaboration and a very active collaboration with Lara Benfato from Sapienza University. And through Lara Benfato, many other people, I have listed two of the key collaborators in this work. And for the electron microscopy, which is a central characterization tool for our sample, we rely on these two extremely competent electron microscopists. Okay, so with this, let me start. Let me start with today's presentation. So, what I will be talking about is broadly related to the phenomena of melting. Now, we all know what melting is. If you take any solid and you heat it at high temperature, at some characteristic temperature, it will melt into a liquid. And as we have read in school, this solid to liquid transition is normally a first order phase transition, and there is a latent heat involved. Now, if you look at this microscopically, then what you see is that. Excuse me, is there a difficulty? Okay.
Yeah, please. And I request everybody to mute themselves because I think otherwise it creates.
Okay, so if you take any solid, any crystalline solid, we know that we have this kind of periodic array of atoms. And when we increase temperature, you start exciting lattice waves, which we know as phonons. and therefore we will see each atom is actually oscillating about its mean position, and therefore the perfect periodicity is lost. Then you go to higher and higher temperature, so this oscillation amplitude increases, and when it reaches a certain fraction of the lattice constant, then the solid is no longer stable, your order is completely destroyed, and you get into a liquid. This is normally known as the Lindemann criteria. So Lindemann criteria is the particular fraction of vibration at which the particular amplitude of vibration at which the solid no longer remains stable. Now one can ask ourselves whether temperature just excites phonons. No, temperature actually can also excite something else, and that something else is called topological defect. So what is topological defect? Let me give you a very simple example. Suppose you take this handset. So you have this telephone where the receiver is connected through this spiraling cord. When you buy a new telephone, you have this nice spiraling cord.
Pratap, your slide has not changed. It is on your start of the first slide.
The slide has not changed?
No.
What is that?
I don't know where your cursor is. Yeah, now it has changed. Now you have to always bring on the cursor.
I see. Are you seeing slide 3?
We are seeing slide 3. Yes.
Okay. So let me explain what topological defects are. You have let's say this telephone, and you have this nice spiraling cord. After a few days, almost in every telephone you will see this, that this spiraling cord is no longer a perfect spiral, but it has these kinks. Now, if you look carefully, these kinks are non-trivial objects, because you have these kinks. These are some local defect here, but you cannot get rid of these kinks by doing something locally here. Because on one side of the kink, the wire is wound in one direction, in the other side it's wound in the opposite direction. So for example, if you have to get rid of these defects here, then you have to unwind this entire wire in between and then wind it in the right direction. So these kind of defects, which are actually protected by symmetry, these are what are called topological defects. And in nature, you have various kinds of topological defects. For example, vortices, the vortices that you see in the water when it flows through your wash basin, or the vortices in a superfluid, these are examples of topological defect. You have more exotic topological defect like skyrmions in magnetic systems. And if you take a solid here, the topological defect is in the form of dislocation, where you have, for example, you have this periodic solid, but here it seems that you have an additional row of atom that is coming and ending at some point here without continuing throughout the crystal. All right, now what you can ask yourself, these kind of topological defects that you will also excite when you heat a solid, can they induce melting? This is the problem which in the 70s, these two gentlemen, David Thouless and his postdoc Kosterlitz, they started working on. And they took a very simple model, which is called the XY model. So XY model is you have these spins, and the spins can only point in the XY direction, XY referring to the plane. So they have no component out of plane, which is the Z direction. And then you have a ferromagnetic coupling between them. So it is the usual minus J SI dot Sj. And you can write it as cos theta I minus theta j by defining the angle of this spin with some general reference axis. At low temperature, you have
Have you changed your slide? Because for us it's very difficult to know. You are still on the slide saying topological defects. Each time you change your slide, you have to bring the cursor on the screen. Otherwise, it is not going to change. Yeah. Yeah, we can see it now. Yeah. Now it's a two-dimensional XY model.
Oh, I see. So what do I have to do actually to, okay, all right. Because it is changing here. Why is it not changing there? All right. So let me then explain the XY model again. So you have here this collection of spins which can only have component in the plane, and that means it can have a component in the XY direction. The XY refers to the plane. It does not have any component out of the plane, which is the Z direction. And you have a ferromagnetic coupling between these adjacent spins. Now, if you are at low temperature, you have actually almost an ordered state. So, strictly speaking, it's a quasi-ordered state, but that quasi-ordered, it's not very important for our argument here. So, we will pretend that you have an ordered state at low temperature. When you increase temperature, here the topological defect that you will excite are called vortices. Now, what are vortices? Vortices are here what I show by either this red points or this green point here. And the mathematical definition of that, so you can see that around the red point you have these spins which seem to be winding around. Here also it's winding around, or you have spins which seem to go out of this topological defect. So mathematically, if I take any contour like this, enclosing a topological defect, and I calculate this integral, so this integral, what it's doing is that I am adding this twist in the face along this contour. So if I have a topological defect here, when I add them, I will get 2 pi or minus 2 pi. If I don't have any topological defect here, then in half the contour I will be adding up, in half the contour I will be subtracting, and I will get 0. Now, this topological defect, you can show that the energy to create one vortex is given by this Js. Js is actually this quantity, Js squared, and pi log n. Now, this is important. It depends, n is the total number of spins, so it goes logarithmically with. Now, if I take any vortex, I can put it anywhere on these n sides. So, therefore, the entropy is kB log n again. So, free energy would be E minus Ef, which is 2J minus kBT log n. What is the consequence? So, I am going to the next slide. Are you seeing the next slide?
No, we don't. You have to do the same thing.
Okay.
You bring your cursor here. Yeah.
All right. So now, if you are at low temperature, then you try to create a topological defect, and since this quantity, this prefactor is positive, and here you have log n, which is logarithm of the system size, you have a large increase in the free energy. Therefore, it's energetically completely unfavorable to create a vortex at low temperature. However, when I cross this temperature, which is 2J by Kb, then this prefactor becomes negative. Now, if I create a vortex, I will have a very large decrease in the free energy. So therefore, it will become entropically favorable to create these vortices. So the free energy will decrease as soon as I create the vortex. So if I decrease the free energy by creating one vortex, I can also create two vortex and three vortex and so on, which means that I will have a sudden proliferation of vortices, and my magnetization will suddenly crash to zero. So when I am plotting this magnetization, I am assuming that each of these spin has some magnetic moment associated with it. So here in the ordered state, I had a finite magnetization, and that magnetization has suddenly crashed to zero. Now, whenever you have this sudden jump in, let's say, something like magnetization, you tell yourself that this is a first order phase transition. We know that in a first order phase transition, an order parameter has an abrupt jump. But this is where David Thouless and Kosterlitz got startled. Because when you think about it, here this is not a first order phase transition. Look at this free energy. The free energy does not have any discontinuity. It is going smoothly across the transition, nor do the derivatives of the free energy have any discontinuity. So it's not a first order transition, it's not even a second order transition. It's a transition where the free energy is just smoothly going across the transition. And that is when they realize that they have discovered a new kind of phase transition, which is actually an entropic transition, which we now know as the Kosterlitz-Thouless transition. And this is what got them the Nobel Prize many years later. Now, there is a twist in the story. Berezinski was a Russian scientist who actually had gotten almost all these results theoretically 1 year before Kosterlitz and Thouless. But he wrote this paper in Russian, and more importantly in Russian style, which is very difficult to follow. And therefore, Berezinski's work was not very well known before Kosterlitz's work got publicized. And unfortunately, Berezinski also died early, so he did not get the Nobel Prize. But this transition is nowadays called the BKT transition, which is Berezinski-Kosterlitz-Thouless transition. Okay, so since this was a rather unique kind of transition, there was a lot of interest. And there was a lot of interest to try to see this transition. Now, before I go into the experiments, let me now tell you another aspect of the transition. So, the initial work of Kosterlitz and Thouless was done on this 2D XY model. But suppose you want to translate the same work. I hope that this time the slide has. Can you see the slide written topological defects in a two-dimensional crystal?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Now it's working. All the time you have to just bring the cursor.
Okay, that is fine. Okay. So, how would this BKT transition manifest if you translate into a two-dimensional crystal? So, suppose I take a two-dimensional hexagonal crystal like this. Here, the topological defect, the equivalent of my kink, which I got in the telephone wire, or the equivalent of the vortex, is this kind of defect, which is called dislocation, which I have already mentioned to you about. So, dislocation, technically, here you can see every point has 6 nearest neighbor. Every lattice point has 6 nearest neighbor. A dislocation is this pair of points where red has 5 nearest neighbor and green has 7 nearest neighbor. Together, this object is called a dislocation. Kosterlitz and Thouless, they predicted that when they will have this, at some point you will have these dislocations which will proliferate in a two-dimensional crystal and destroy your solid into a two-dimensional liquid. As it so happens, they were only partially correct. Why? So you can see this cartoon of the crystalline solid here, hexagonal solid, and then you have here large number of dislocations which have proliferated. This dislocation are these red-white pairs here. However, what was realized is that this state, which Kosterlitz and Thouless thought is the liquid state, is actually not a liquid. And you can see that if you look at the Fourier transform. So if you do the Fourier transform of this, which is the same as doing a diffraction experiment, you get 6 sharp spots here. Here you can see those spots have become extremely wide, but still the 6-fold symmetry remains. The 6-fold symmetry remains. That implies that you have not lost the orientational order. Soon it was understood that what is destroyed in this phase transition is the positional order, which means that if I know the position of a vortex here, I can no longer predict the position of a vortex far away. But the orientational order remains, which means that if I know the bond orientation at some point here, I can approximately predict the bond orientation of a bond that is far away within an accuracy that is less than, within an inaccuracy that is less than 60 degrees. And then it was Halperin, Nelson and Young who realized that this state to go into a liquid will have to undergo another Kosterlitz-Thouless transition through another set of topological defects. So what is this other topological defect? This other topological defect is called disclination. Disclination is a 5-fold coordinated or 7-fold coordinated or sometimes 4 or 8-fold coordinated point which does not have an opposite kind of nearest neighbor. So a dislocation is 5 and 7 adjacent. If these 5 and 7 coordinated points are far away, they are separated, then this defect is called a disclination. And this disclination destroys the complete order. So this state at some higher temperature will undergo another Kosterlitz-Thouless transition where you will have this disclination that I am showing here. For example, this red point circled in green or this white point circled in purple, these are the disclination. And when you have this disclination, your orientational order is completely lost and you have a liquid. So if this is a liquid and this is a solid, what do you have in between? In between what you have is what we know now as a hexatic fluid. It's a strange state of matter which is partially a solid and partially a liquid. It does not have positional order. It does not, but it does have orientational order. More importantly, like a liquid, it has the ability to flow. So it's a fluid state. It's not a solid state. But it cannot flow uniformly in all directions. So a hexatic fluid has a preferential flow direction. It flows preferentially along the principal axis of the orientational order. For example, it can flow by plane sliding like this and the dislocation moving out, but it cannot flow easily in a direction that is, let's say, in between two principal axes, which is 30 degrees from a principal axis. Okay, so it has the ability to flow but along preferential direction. Now, given the unique nature of this state, there was a lot of attempt to search for a hexatic fluid. The obvious thing to look at is a 2D solid like graphene, but for obvious reasons again that does not work, because if you take a 2-dimensional sheet of, let's say, graphite, there is no reason that it has to be constrained in 2 dimensions. So by the time you heat it and you go even close to the melting, it has buckled up, it has become a nanotube, it has folded, and therefore it's not a 2-dimensional system. So then people try to study other things like electrons on a helium surface, which forms a Wigner crystal, gas molecules adsorbed on graphite, charge density wave, and each of these had some problem or the other for which a neat Kosterlitz-Thouless transition could not be seen. A hexatic fluid state could not be seen. For example, if you take this gas molecule adsorbed on graphite, then it appears that it's a two-dimensional system, but you have the graphite below. So the interaction with the graphite makes it three-dimensional. The only thing that so far had some success is magnetic colloidal crystals, in which people have seen definite signatures of a hexatic fluid. But what we wanted to study is vortex lattice in a superconductor. Now, a very brief introduction. We know that if you take a type 2 superconductor, then it's a perfect diamagnet at small field, but above a characteristic field, Hc1, you have the magnetic field that can enter in the superconductor in the form of flux tubes. These flux tubes are often called vortices because they have a circulating current around it which sustains this magnetic field. And each of these flux tubes carries a flux which is quantized, and it is one flux quantum given by this universal constant h by 2e. Now this is looking at the superconductor from the side, let's say. If I look at it from the top, what I will see is that I have this circulating supercurrent, and at the center of this vortex, I have the vortex core, and this core actually, because of the magnetic field, it has become a normal metal. So I have this normal metal core surrounded by a supercurrent. It is carrying a magnetic flux of one flux quantum, and these gray regions are of course superconducting. Now, this is how a flux line lattice looks like. This is how the vortex lattice looks like, and how we get such images I will tell you in a moment. All right, now this kind of a vortex lattice, it behaves like a solid because you have these vortices that are like small bar magnet with same polarity. So therefore they repel each other, and this repulsion normally arranges this vortex lattice into a hexagonal lattice, and that is what we know as the Abrikosov flux line lattice. Now, this Abrikosov flux line lattice, it's like a virtual solid, though it's not a solid made of physical objects, it's made of these flux tubes, but otherwise it has all the properties of a solid. So if you heat that solid can melt. If you apply pressure on the solid, here the equivalent of pressure is to increase the density of flux tube. When you apply pressure, you increase the density of atoms. Here you want to increase the density of this flux tube, which means you increase the magnetic field. So increasing magnetic field is same as increasing pressure. That can also melt this vortex lattice. So the phase diagram, when you include this complication, is a little bit more complex. You have this Meissner state here, but then this region, which is the mixed state, actually has a region here where you have a vortex solid, but then when you increase temperature, you can melt into a liquid, or as you will see later, in a glass. And if you also increase magnetic field, you can melt into a liquid or a glass. So you have this additional line that separates this mixed state into vortex solid and vortex liquid. Now this melting transition gives its signature in various properties. For example, if you measure the critical current of the superconductor, you will see that at this melting transition, you have a sudden anomalous increase in the critical current. So this is as a function of magnetic field, and I am going in this direction. I am increasing the magnetic field at a fixed temperature. And this is the data by Henderson et al. And you see that this critical current normally you would have expected to reduce continuously to zero here. But instead it shows this large anomalous increase here, and it shows this peak before crashing to zero. So this increase is a signature of this order-disorder transition. You can also get the same thing by, instead of increasing magnetic field, increasing here the temperature at a fixed magnetic field. This phenomena, which is called the peak effect, and which is sort of the most telltale signature of the melting of the vortex lattice, can also be seen in other measurements, like for example AC susceptibility, where instead of a peak this manifests as a dip, because larger critical current means stronger diamagnetic response. So you have this, instead of the diamagnetic response monotonically going to zero from a negative value, you see this anomalous change. And this is a signature of this order-disorder transition. In magnetization, you can see this as opening up of the hysteresis loop and so on. Now, these kind of bulk measurement have been used to look at this vortex lattice melting for many years. And in fact, people have constructed phase diagrams like this from bulk measurements. In TFR, this was a relatively big activity under Arun Grover, Ramke and his students like Satyajit, who are at IIT Kanpur. And they also looked at more intricate details of the bulk response to try to unravel various stable and metastable phases, as you can see here. Okay, when we started the work, however, we wanted to take a different approach, and our approach was to look at the vortex lattice in real space to see what happens. So how do we look at the vortex lattice in real space? The technique that we use is scanning tunneling spectroscopy. So I think here almost everyone has heard of a scanning tunneling microscope. You have a sample like this here, and you come on the sample with a very fine normal metal tip, but then you come very close without touching it, so that you can have quantum mechanical tunneling of electrons from this tip to the sample through a vacuum barrier. And then you can measure the conductance of this junction. You can either measure the conductance or you can measure the absolute, the AC of the DC conductance of this junction. Alright, so the way we image vortices is like this. You come with this normal metal tip on this superconductor. So this sample now is a superconductor, and I have applied magnetic field to produce vortices. So when this tip, let's say, is at point A here, I don't have a vortex at point A. So I am tunneling from a normal metal to a superconductor. Now I move the tip and I come to point C. Now remember, the core of the vortex is a normal metal. So therefore, now when I am at point C, I am tunneling from a normal metal to a normal metal. Then I go again at point B, and I am again tunneling from a normal metal to a superconductor. So the tunneling conductance of a normal metal to normal metal and normal metal to superconductor has a slight difference. And therefore, if I keep on recording the conductance at all points here, I keep rastering the tip and recording the conductance. Wherever I have a vortex, I will see that the conductance is slightly lower, so it will manifest as a minima in this conductance map. And therefore, from these minima, I can find out where the vortices are, and that is how such an image is recorded. You can do this over larger area, and then you will get a vortex image. like the one I am showing you here in this corner. Okay, so this is just an advertisement slide, and this is our toy. This is our favorite toy in the lab. It's a millikelvin scanning tunneling microscope. It works down to about 350 millikelvin, and we can apply a magnetic field up to 9 Tesla. More importantly, we have a very interesting design which allows us to do in situ measurements on thin films which are grown on insulating substrates, superconducting films on insulating substrate, without ever exposing the sample to air. So any STM data that I will be showing you are on pristine surfaces which have never been exposed to air, and that's very important to get reliable data. So this, I will not go into the details of this. If anyone is interested in the detail, you can refer to this paper where all the details have been published. So this is an entirely home-built scanning tunneling microscope. All right, so now using this toy, we decided to investigate the order-disorder transition of the vortex lattice. So we took a rather well-known system which is niobium diselenide. Niobium diselenide is a superconductor with a TC of about 7 Kelvin, and the good thing is that one can grow very high quality single crystals. So these single crystals were grown in Amijavel's lab. And more importantly, it's a layered material. So therefore, just like, for example, graphite, you can cleave off and have atomically smooth surfaces. So this is our crystal. This is a typical crystal, rather we have many crystals of this kind. We took a plate which is about 60 to 100 nanometers, so it's a thin plate. And we decided to look at how the vortex lattice evolves in this crystal. So before we started, we did the measurement of AC susceptibility, and we observed that there should be an order to disorder transition between this 25 kilohertz state and between 16 kilohertz state and 25 kilohertz state. But we wanted to see how actually the disordering proceeds. Now, before I go ahead, let me just clarify one thing. This is how the images of the vortex lattice that we captured with our STM looks like. When I will show you images like this, which are this superimposed lines. Now, these lines are not part of the experimental data. They are put by hand by us later on to identify nearest neighbor. But how do we identify nearest neighbor? And that there is a very well-defined mathematical prescription. So suppose you have a set of points.
Once again. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So here, this is the kind of images that we capture, but this is the kind of images that I will be showing you. And the difference is that in these images, you have these additional lines here joining the vortices. And these lines are actually showing the nearest neighbor. They are joining the nearest neighbor. But the question is, how do I define the nearest neighbor? The mathematical prescription of defining nearest neighbor is called Delaunay triangulation, and it is like this. Suppose I have a set of points. Now, how do I determine which one is whose nearest neighbor? So I take any 3 points. Let's say I take this point, and this point. So I take this set of these 3 points and I draw a circumcircle with these 3 points. If this circumcircle has another point inside, then these 3 are not nearest neighbor. For example, the circumcircle that I have drawn here has this point here. So therefore, these 3 points are not nearest neighbor. But when I draw a circumcircle like this, with these 3 points, there is no other point inside. So these 3 points are nearest neighbor, and I will join them with lines. This is the way you can uniquely determine the nearest neighbor, and that's very important for us to identify topological defect. So with this, let us start looking at the vortex lattices, and I will start with 15 kilohertz state here, which is before the melting, before the order disorder transition starts. So here I have a nice vortex lattice. If I take a Fourier transform, I have 6 sharp spots, and there is no topological defect. I go to slightly higher field. Here I cross this onset field, and I start seeing dislocations. When I have dislocations, I still have the orientational order, as I have explained to you before, but the Bragg spots get broader, and then the Bragg spots get even broader, and then even broader, and that is when I have reached these 20, I'm close to 25 kilohertz there. So here the Bragg spots are really very broad, but you can still see the 6-fold orientation, and in the field of view, you see only dislocation. There is no disclination. If you look carefully, every red has a nearest neighbor of white. So sometimes you have this red, white, but you don't have any red which is isolated. But then you cross this HP, and the moment you cross this HP, you see that now you have this disclination here. You have a disclination here, a disclination here, a disclination here. These are points that I have circled in green or purple for clarity. And now if you take a Fourier transform, you have a ring. Your orientational order is also destroyed. And then if you go further up, you have more of disclinations, and then eventually the vortices become so fast moving that your image becomes blurred and we cannot see anything. So when we got this result, we were extremely happy because we thought that we have found another example of the BKT transition. So far, the only one that is known for sure is in magnetic colloids, as I've told you before. But then our celebration was really short-lived. Because as I told you, that the hexatic state has to be a fluid state. It should have the ability to flow in preferential direction, but nevertheless flow, which means that there should be dynamics. But then we took this image, let's say here, and staying at the same temperature, the same magnetic field, at the same position, we kept on scanning for 24 hours. So this is a spectacular technical achievement for our system, that we can stay exactly at the same point for hours at ends and actually for days. So when we took this, we took an image every hour for 24 hours. We saw that there is no change at all. Each image is effectively superposing with each other, except for the noise level, which sometimes shows a very slight change here and there. And if you particularly see topological defect, they are not moving anywhere. So they are remaining wherever they are. So which means that I don't have a fluid state really. What I have is a glass. It's like my window glass, which is completely disordered like a liquid, but it has no temporal activity.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
So suppose if maybe it's a stupid question. Suppose if I have a fluid and I don't do anything to it, then it won't flow, right? It can stay very still.
What about Brownian motion?
Okay, okay.
That is what Einstein taught us long back. There is Brownian motion.
Okay, yes, Brownian motion will be there. Okay,
yes.
You are saying that it is perfectly superimposing. Okay,
exactly, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. So The point is that here, remember, the vortices are the equivalent of your atom in a liquid, or the molecule in a liquid. Okay, so we realize very soon why we are not seeing a hexatic fluid state, and we also realize that this is not the BKT transition at all. Because first of all, what we had not carefully studied at that time is that we had not estimated what is the bending length of these vortices. Now these vortices, when I drew a cartoon, I drew them as straight lines like this, but they need not be straight lines. They are more like spaghettis. So they are spaghettis and they can bend, they can even intertwine with each other sometimes. And if you, from the elasticity, you can calculate what would be the typical bending length at a temperature. And at this temperature, the bending length would be something like 1 to 10 micron. So if you have to consider something as really two-dimensional, you need to be at a thickness which is much smaller than this bending length. We took crystals which were 50 to 100 micron. This particular experiment was on a 50 micron crystal. And therefore, it's not even two-dimensional, and we should not expect really Kosterlitz-Thouless transition. Then why are we seeing this hexatic glass? That also we figured out, and that is actually because of pinning. Pinning means we have defects in, so this is now a high resolution, atomic resolution image taken on a tiny portion of this crystal using the same STM. And here you see selenium atoms, but you also see some points which are darker here. So these darker points we later figured out, these are actually cobalt impurities in my diagram diselenide. And these cobalt impurities, they act as potential wells for the vortices. So when you have a vortex lattice, this is a cartoon of a vortex lattice, it's not a real vortex lattice. So when I have these vortices like this, for example, these vortex will try to get displaced from its equilibrium position in this lattice and go at the potential well position. So this distortion actually is producing the hexatic glass state. Now why this distortion is not completely destroying it into an amorphous state and why it is producing a hexatic glass is a very interesting question, and this is a StatMech question that we have addressed in these papers, but nevertheless that's not what I am talking about today. This was essentially for us a failed experiment. So with this knowledge, we decided that, so these gave us an idea of what are the constraints that we have if we have to see a hexatic fluid, a hexatic vortex fluid. Now, one thing is that we need to be in systems that are extremely low pinning, so in a way that are very uniform. Second thing that we realized is also shown here. We realize that a crystalline superconductor is very bad for our search, and that is because in niobium diselenide, we perform these experiments, we perform detailed experiments actually of the orientation of the vortex lattice. And whether with magnetic field, for example, the orientation changes, whether the vortex lattice rotates and so on. And in these experiments, what we realize is that the vortex lattice orientation has a very strong coupling with the underlying crystal orientation. So in fact, the vortex lattice is the equilibrium state of the vortex lattice, the stable state of the vortex lattice is always aligned along the principal direction of the crystalline lattice. So this is imposing, if you want, a orientational order. You can of course realize metastable states that where this vortex lattice is misorientated with respect to the crystal lattice, but those who are metastable state, you can shake them, and the moment you shake them, they will undergo a transition into this oriented state. So this is an additional complicacy that we did not want to have. And therefore, after quite a bit of search, we decided that a good candidate for us would be amorphous molybdenum germanium. Now, molybdenum germanium is often written as MOGE, doesn't mean that it is 50-50 MOGE. The composition is more like MO70 GE30. So we made these targets in Thamijavel's lab again, and with pulse laser deposition, we could make these amorphous MOGE superconducting films which have a TC of something like 7 Kelvin. So you can see the TEM images. It's completely amorphous, featureless, and it has these broad rings, which also you get for an amorphous superconductor. The film that I will be showing the results today had a thickness of about 20 nanometer. Now, other than being an amorphous superconductor, so because it's an amorphous superconductor, it does not have any orient. Yes?
Sorry for the interruption. Will it be possible to have it winded in another 5 minutes so that we can have questions?
Okay. I will try to go through it quickly. All right. Okay. So other than the fact that it's an amorphous superconductor and it is very weakly pinned, it's otherwise an unremarkable superconductor in the sense it follows BCS theory very well. So the problem with this superconductor, however, is that its surface gets oxidized very fast. So we use this technique where we have a ultra-high vacuum suitcase. So we grow this in this pulse laser deposition chamber, and then with this manipulator, we take the sample in this ultra-high vacuum suitcase where it is kept at 10 to the power minus 10 torr. Then we can disengage it, connect it to the STM, and then it goes straight in the high vacuum, low temperature STM without having been ever exposed to air. Now this is very important, and this is actually the reason why no one had done this measurement on molybdenum germanium, because molybdenum germanium, the moment you expose it to air, it gets oxidized and you don't get any reliable data. Okay, so this is the result. We get 1 kilo Ørsted, we have a vortex solid. Then 3 kilo Ørsted, we start having dislocations. And then we have more of dislocations up to 70 kilo Ørsted. But we still have the orientational order. Above 70 kilo Ørsted, we have disclinations, and this is the isotropic state. So here all order is lost. But now we have to ask the same question. Is this a vortex, is this a hexatic glass or a hexatic fluid? To answer this question, we did this following experiment. So we take a small area and then we keep tracking the position of each vortex at 15 minutes interval. So when you keep on tracking these vortices, you see that when it's a solid, you just have very small motion of the vortices around its main position. Then when you go to the hexatic, it starts flowing. But in the hexatic, it flows along preferential direction. Look at, for example, this image here. These lines, this is the trajectory of each vortex that is being shown. I am zooming this region, and you can see the vortices are moving either in this direction or 60 degree from it or 120 degree with respect to this direction. So it is flowing, but it is flowing only along preferential direction. It's clearer here, for example, at 55 kilo Ørsted, if I look at this small region, the vortices are moving along this direction, which is again one principal direction. So this is the This is the equivalent of the Brownian motion. I am not applying any drive here. But when I go into isotropic liquid, which is at 70 kilohertz state, now you can see that the motion is completely random, and that is what you expect for a hexatic, isotropic liquid. So this tells you that we are going actually from a solid to a hexatic fluid and then to an isotropic liquid. And this is consistent with the hexatic fluid that was predicted by Kosterlitz and Thouless. We can also calculate the metric of orientational order, which is the Chi6. And then what we observe is that if at 2 Kelvin I increase the magnetic field, this Chi6 is finite up to, let's say, 55 kilohertz state. At 70 kilohertz state, it rapidly crashes close to 0. Okay, so from our dynamics, we have found the hexatic fluid and the isotropic liquid. Now, to conclude, let me now show a little bit of what is the implication of this hexatic and isotropic liquid and the vortex solid as far as transport is concerned. Because at the end in the superconductor, what you care about is transport. So, if you look at a vortex lattice like this in a superconductor and you apply a current, then you will have these vortices that will move in this direction, and because they move in this direction, there will be an induced voltage which will oppose this current, and I will have a dissipation which is a linear IV characteristic. On the other hand, if I have pinning, then these few pins, in the case of a vortex solid, will pin this entire vortex solid here. So now this current will apply a force on the vortices, the Lorentz force, but this vortex lattice will not move till I reach some current which is the critical current where it overcomes this spinning force. And now I will have again dissipation, then the slope will be roughly similar. What happens if I have a vortex fluid? Now if I have a vortex fluid, in that case, these few pins can never block the motion of all the vortices, because this is like putting obstruction in a river. So therefore what will happen is that even at very low currents, I will start having a dissipation, but that dissipation will be much smaller than if it was unpinned, because I have this obstruction which is hindering the flow of vortices. And then at, of course, high current, I will have a finite slope. So if I have to distinguish between a vortex solid, liquid, then I need to look at very small currents which are much lower than the critical current. This is what I am showing here, and this is the IV characteristics. This is the IV characteristics. Now I have to look at this region here, which is at very small currents. Let me expand this region. And what you see is this. At low fields, which is up to 1.9 kilohertz state, there is no voltage that appears, so the resistance is 0. But after that, you have a small voltage that keeps appearing and then which gradually increases. So if I plot the slope, if I plot the resistance from the slope of the IV curve, I see that around 1.9 kilohertz state, I start seeing this finite dissipation appearing, and this is the transition from a solid to a hexatic fluid. Okay, now this is the first transition. What about the second transition? I can continue measuring this slope up to higher currents, and what I will see is this. In the hexatic, I have this resistance which is this resistance at very small current, which is saturating. But then when I enter the isotropic liquid, this resistance again increases rapidly. Why does it increase? That's because In the hexatic fluid, the vortices can flow only in preferential directions. But now when it enters in the isotropic liquid, it can move in all directions freely. So I have a large increase in the effective mobility. So now using these transport signatures, I can do this measurement at many temperatures, and then I can construct the phase diagram. And what I see is that I have this vortex solid here. At some field, it goes into a hexatic fluid, and at a higher field, it goes into an isotropic liquid. So, since I'm short of time, I'll end here. And the only thing that I would like to mention is that one of the puzzle and the interest that we have here is that if you look at this phase diagram, it is not surprising that at finite temperature you can have a fluid state. But normally we know that barring helium, any other liquid at low enough a temperature goes into a solid. And helium doesn't go into a solid. That's because it's a very special object. It's a quantum fluid, where the 0-point fluctuation is large enough to keep helium into a fluid state down to T equal to 0. Well, it becomes a superfluid. That's an additional aspect of helium. Now, in this case, the hexatic fluid state, it extends over very large region of the HT parameter space, even down to very low temperature. This is very interesting, and this opens the possibility that the hexatic fluid could actually be a quantum fluid. This is something that we are right now exploring. We have some interesting data, but I will stop here. And if anyone is interested, I can discuss that separately. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. From the online audience, is there any question? Is there any question from the online? You can just unmute yourself and ask the question, if there is a question.
I'm trying to get back in the meeting.
I student. So, any question from the student? Please don't be shy, students. Do you want to ask a question? Pratap, I have a question. You mentioned of this having this metric like psi 6. And of course, if it is a solid, you have the psi 6 1. And if it is in between 1 and 0, you conclude that it is a hexatic. But
Okay, 1 minute. So I think the psi 6 in a solid, it's not 1. It is 1 only at T equal to 0.
Right.
If you have defects in the solid, then in psi 6 is finite, but it's not 1.
Exactly. So my point was, suppose you have a patchy situation, right? For example, you have some solid patches in a liquid. So that can arise when melting, right?
Yeah, all right. That is true. So the point is that
distinguish it from such a kind of a hexatic fluid unless I have some measure of some dynamics, because this metric is actually a static quantity.
So the point is, you can have a solid and a liquid, let's say,
yes,
which is coexisting.
Yes.
Now that part from let's say we have tried to study this from large area. Large area images is the largest that we can get, which typically are 1.2 micron or so. So that has about 1,000 or 1,200 vortices. Now within that we don't see such states at within that field of view. So whenever we see, let's say, motion, we see motion of all of them. We don't see some of the region which remains sort of static, and in between regions which have large motion. Having said that, we see those kind of states in one situation, and that is actually at very low fields. At very low fields, we see polycrystalline domains. Now, higher fields, we don't see that anymore. And when we see those polycrystalline domains, let me see if I have any image here. So in those polycrystalline domains, we sometimes see the motion in the domain boundary. But the point is, when I'm saying we don't see that, it means that we don't see that within the field of view that we have, which of course is not very large, as you can see here.
Yes.
But this is the sort of state of the art at the moment. One cannot get too much more than this.
Yes. And
Actually, I don't think one can get more than this. This may be the largest kind of images that are reported with STM in literature. There is another form of measurement which has imaged very large vortex lattices, and that is bitter decoration. But bitter decoration, unfortunately, the problem is that you cannot do the dynamics because it's a single shot measurement. You evaporate iron and you take a snapshot. So the iron gets deposited at regions where the vortices are. Then you take out your sample and look under a microscope, but that gives you a snapshot. You cannot look at the dynamics there. Or you cannot even check.
The question is, since you are, also doing the time measurement, is it possible to look at any of the dynamical correlation, for example? And since you talked about this metric, you can also look at some of the dynamical correlation.
Yes. So that is something that is there on the cards, but we have not done it yet.
Okay.
So the reason that the problem that we have is that STM is actually a slow measurement. So when I am showing you these snapshots, these are snapshots taken at 15 minutes interval, and we are joining the points. So we can only look at slow dynamics. We cannot look at fast dynamics. There is a way that we could also look at fast dynamics, and that is something we are trying now, is to stay on one vortex and try to look at the noise.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Exactly, I understood that. So, but that measurement is something we haven't done yet.
Oh. Yeah, I see one hand raised from Atin. Atin, can you please ask the question?
Yeah. Very nice stuff, Pradipta. So one question is that first question, slide number 14,
Okay.
on the AC susceptibility data on NBAC2.
Yes.
So I just want to know why there is a difference between this ZFC and FC.
Oh, wait a minute. Now this is not ZFC and FC.
So something like ZFC I can see.
Yeah.
Red.
So, okay, let me tell you. This is the increase and this is decrease.
So red is in, okay.
Red is when I am increasing the magnetic field, and black is when I am decreasing it.
Okay.
Now there are, so this aspect of the data. So now you will say why this hysteresis. This hysteresis is because this is a first order phase transition. Okay. This actually is in susceptibility and magnetization. This has been studied by many people for many years. including Grover, Satyajit, Ravi Kumar, and so on. Now, these, but in real space, we have also done this experiment through imaging, and it's very interesting because this is related to superheating and supercooling of the phases, and you can actually get superheated and supercooled vortex lattice phases. So how do you know? You start from a solid, you cross the boundary of the phase transition, it remains a solid. But then you apply a small magnetic field pulse and it immediately becomes amorphous.
Okay.
Okay, and you know that it was a superheated phase. In fact, this was through which we have shown that this is actually a first order phase transition.
Okay. Okay. And so have you tried to go down to thinner layer?
Okay, so with niobium diselenide we did not, because in niobium diselenide, the way we did, we could not have gone too much lower. Means what we do is that we put a thin plate, whatever thin you can do by looking at it, and then we have a scotch tape on it,
Yeah.
and then in vacuum we pull it, so you expose the surface. Now, how much the scotch tape has taken along with it, we don't have a control.
Yeah, I understand.
So what is remaining is something that we can only see after we have done the experiment. And in most of the cases, we found that to be in this order. We could not get a situation where most of it is coming out with the tape, and we are left with few monolayers.
So I didn't understand actually. Maybe can you please explain once more why you have not got the hexatic liquid in this NBSC2? Like what was the origin?
Yes, so we did not get it for two reasons. One reason is I have skipped this, I will show you this. There are two reasons we did not get it. One reason is that so you need for a BKT transition, you need a two-dimensional system.
Yeah,
now,
that's
when
okay.
you consider the vortex lattice to be two-dimensional, when you can consider each vortex almost as point object, and then they are on a plane. But if the vortex is long and inside it has this third degree of freedom of bending, then it is no longer a three-dimensional, it's no longer a two-dimensional system. It has activity in the third dimension, which sort of makes it not a system in which you should see BKT. Second thing is that these were considered, the defect was there was considerable amount of pinning. And the pinning prevented the disordered state from becoming a fluid. It remained into a glassy state. So if you want a very rough analogy, the pinning played the same role as glass formers play in actual glasses. So for example, when you have borosilicate glass, you have to put that boron, which will act as the glass former. That actually prevents the long range order to establish. Here the pinning is doing the same thing.
Okay.
And in fact, what we realized is that if we go to cleaner, and so this, whatever I have shown you was on this sample, which was intermediate intermediate cleanliness. If you go to dirtier sample, you see a larger hexatic. If you go to cleaner sample, you see that the hexatic shrinks. So this hexatic is actually a disordered phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon case.
So these defects are mainly crystalline, like point defects you're talking about, right?
These are mostly point defects.
So in principle, if you can go down to like few layers or single layer, then you should be able to observe hexatic liquid phase here also.
Yes, you should, and that is something that would be extremely interesting to do if we have a way to make very thin layer of this. However,
But you can do transport also, right? Through transport also, you may get some signature, right?
yes, that you can. That is
Okay.
possible. So in fact, but the problem is this, that transport, yes, you can definitely do, but in transport it's difficult to, you see a phase transition in transport that can be identified. But to say that the phase transition is giving you a hexatic, how do you establish that? It's not easy.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, now we know many of the transport signatures of the hexatic, and one can see if similar things happen here.
Okay.
It's interesting to see if similar things happen here, because here you also have a crystalline lattice. So there is also an imposed orientational order which will probably modify the hexatic phase diagram. What it will do to the hexatic is a very interesting question in itself.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, let's thank Professor Pratap Raichaudhuri once again for very interesting and illuminating talk. And students, if you have really questions, you can actually, I think Pratap, you won't mind if they post you some question or something.
Yeah. So feel free to contact if you want to contact in any other way. If you want to have a, if you want to ask on a separate meeting, that also is fine. Just drop me a mail.
Yeah. So make use of this opportunity which he has actually extended. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you everyone.